If you close your eyes and imagine a road, you might picture asphalt, smooth and black, stretching toward the horizon. Perhaps you see painted lines, traffic signals, the hum of engines passing by. But long before any of this, before the automobile, before the bicycle, even before the medieval cart paths that wound through European countryside, there were roads that defined what a road could be. These were the roads of Rome. Not merely paths worn by countless footsteps, but carefully constructed layers of stone and gravel, fitted together with such precision that many of them remain visible today, more than 2,000 years after they were built. Some still carry traffic. Some lie beneath modern highways. Others rest quietly in fields, their original purpose long since fulfilled, yet their presence endures. This is a story about patience, about the methodical placement of one stone after another, day after day, year after year, about the hands that lifted these stones, the minds that planned their arrangement, and the empire that depended on their completion. We will not hurry through this story. There is no need to rush. The Romans themselves did not rush. They understood that a road built properly would outlast the builders, outlast the empire itself, and so they worked with care, with attention to detail, with a respect for the materials and the land. Let us begin at the beginning, with the question of why. Why did Rome need roads? What purpose did they serve in the daily life of the empire? The answer, like the roads themselves, is layered. In the early days of Rome, when the city was still small, still finding its place among the other settlements of the Italian peninsula, there were paths. Animal trails, mostly. Deer and wild boar moving through the landscape, following the easiest routes between water sources and feeding grounds. Humans followed these same paths, for the same reasons. They led somewhere useful. As villages grew and began to trade with one another, these paths saw more use. They widened slightly. The grass wore away where feet fell most often. In muddy seasons, people learned which routes became impassable and which remained firm. Knowledge accumulated slowly, passed from traveler to traveler, from parent to child. But these paths had limitations. After heavy rain, they turned to mud. In dry seasons, dust rose in clouds. Carts could only travel on them with difficulty, and heavy loads often required teams of oxen straining against the weight. There was inefficiency in every journey. Rome's expansion changed this. As the city's influence spread, first across the local region, then across Italy, then eventually across the Mediterranean world, the limitations of simple paths became intolerable. An empire requires communication. Messages must travel between the capital and distant provinces. Armies must move efficiently to defend borders or respond to threats. Trade goods must reach markets. Administrators must journey to their posts. All of this requires roads, not paths, roads. The first major Roman road, the Via Appia, began construction in 312 BCE. It was named after Appius Claudius Caecus, the censor who commissioned it. The road connected Rome to Capua, a distance of about 132 miles. Later, it would be extended all the way to Brundisium, on the heel of Italy's boot, where ships departed for Greece and the eastern Mediterranean. The Via Appia was not merely a route, it was a statement. It declared that Rome could reshape the landscape itself, could impose order on the natural world. But more than this, it was practical. The road allowed Roman legions to move quickly southward, responding to threats or projecting power. It allowed goods to flow more easily to and from Rome. It connected the capital to the wider world. Other roads followed. The Via Flaminia, heading north. The Via Aurelia, along the western coast. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, following an ancient trade route for that precious commodity. Each road had a purpose, usually multiple purposes. Military movement, commerce, communication, the gradual binding together of diverse peoples under a single administration. By the peak of the Roman Empire, the road network stretched for approximately 250,000 miles. Some sources suggest it may have been even longer. These roads reached from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the forests of Germany to the deserts of North Africa. Anywhere Rome governed, roads followed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the network, we must understand a single road. We must understand how it was built, stone by stone, layer by layer. Before a single stone was placed, before any earth was moved, someone had to decide where the road would go. This was not a simple decision. A road between two cities might seem straightforward, simply connect them with a straight line. But the reality of the landscape made this impossible in most cases. Hills rose in the way. Rivers flowed across the path. Marshes spread across low-lying areas. Rocky terrain made excavation difficult. All of these obstacles required consideration. The Romans, characteristically, approached this problem with both practicality and a certain stubbornness. Where possible, they preferred straight roads. A straight road was efficient. It minimized travel time and made navigation simpler. In flat terrain, Roman roads often ran in remarkably straight lines for many miles. But when obstacles arose, the road builders adapted. Rather than climb over a steep hill, they might route around it or cut through it if the hill was small enough. Major rivers required bridges, which meant finding suitable crossing points where the banks were stable and the water flow predictable. Marshy ground could sometimes be crossed by building up a raised causeway, though this required enormous amounts of fill material. The surveyors who planned these routes used tools that were, by modern standards, quite simple. The gromer was one such tool, a wooden cross with plumb bobs hanging from each arm, mounted on a pole. By sighting along the arms of the gromer, a surveyor could establish straight lines and right angles. They would set up the gromer at various points along the proposed route, marking the line with stakes or small markers. For measuring distances, they used the measuring rod, essentially a long stick of standardized length. Teams of workers would carry these rods forward, placing them end to end, counting as they went. Later, a device called a hodometer was developed, a cart with gears that counted wheel rotations, converting them to distance. But for much of Rome's road-building history, the measuring rod sufficed. Determining elevation changes required different techniques. The chorobates was a long, flat board, about 20 feet long, with a groove cut along its upper surface. Water poured into this groove would settle level, revealing whether the board was tilted. By moving the chorobates along the proposed route, surveyors could map the terrain's slope and determine where leveling would be necessary. All of this planning happened before construction began. The surveyors walked the route multiple times, considering alternatives, weighing costs and benefits. They consulted with local people who knew the land, who understood where floods occurred in spring, where snow accumulated in winter, where the ground stayed firm and where it turned to mud. Maps were drawn, though not in the sense we understand maps today. Roman road maps were more schematic, showing the sequence of towns and way stations along a route with distances marked between them, but without the precise geographic detail we expect. The Peutinga table, a medieval copy of a Roman original, shows this approach. Settlements appear as small building symbols, connected by lines representing roads, with numbers indicating miles between stops. Once the route was determined, markers were placed. These might be simple wooden stakes in the ground, or small piles of stones, spaced at regular intervals, to guide the construction crews. The surveying team's work was complete. Now, the builders could begin. But even this beginning was not the beginning of the physical road. First, the ground itself had to be prepared. Imagine standing at the edge of an open field in central Italy, perhaps in the early years of the 3rd century BCE. The morning is cool, dew still clings to the grass. Ahead of you, wooden stakes march into the distance, marking the route the new road will follow. You are part of a construction crew, and today your work begins. The first task is clearing. Anything growing along the marked route must be removed. In some places, this means pulling up grass and low shrubs, relatively easy work. In others, it means felling trees, extracting stumps, clearing away stones. The cleared area is wider than the eventual road will be, typically about twice as wide. This provides room for the construction work itself and ensures that vegetation doesn't immediately encroach on the finished road. This clearing work proceeds slowly. There are no machines, only hand tools. Axes for trees, mattocks for digging, baskets for carrying away debris. The work is rhythmic, repetitive. One swing of the axe, then another. One basket of earth carried away, then another. The crew works in teams, some clearing vegetation, others beginning to excavate the roadbed. Because a Roman road is not built on top of the existing ground, it is built into it. The excavation creates a trench, typically about 3 feet deep, though this varies depending on the terrain and the road's importance. Major roads connecting significant cities might have deeper trenches, more elaborate construction. Smaller roads serving local areas might be simpler, shallower, but the principle remains the same. Dig down first, build up after. Why dig down? Why not simply pile stones on top of the existing surface? The answer lies in stability. The Roman roads were designed to carry heavy traffic marching soldiers, laden carts, cavalry, all in various weather conditions. A road that simply sat on top of the ground would shift and settle unevenly. It would develop ruts. It would wash away in storms. By excavating a trench and filling it with carefully selected materials, the road builders created something much more durable. The excavated trench had to be precise. The bottom needed to be level, or if the terrain sloped, it needed to slope at a consistent, controlled angle. Workers used simple leveling tools, long wooden beams with plumb lines or channels filled with water to ensure the bottom of the trench was properly graded. In some cases, particularly where the road crossed a hillside, the trench might be cut deeper on the uphill side to create a level base. Once excavated, the trench bottom was compacted. Workers stomped on it or used heavy wooden implements to pound the earth firm. This compaction was essential. Any soft spots would eventually settle, causing the layers above to sink and crack. The Romans understood this intuitively. Even without modern soil mechanics, they knew that firm ground stayed firm, and soft ground needed to be made firm. In areas where the natural soil was particularly poor, sandy, or marshy, or prone to shifting, the builders might drive wooden piles into the trench bottom before adding any stone. These piles, typically young tree trunks stripped of branches, were pounded into the ground using a heavy weight, lifted and dropped repeatedly by a team of workers. The piles created a more stable foundation, particularly in wet ground, where they helped distribute weight and prevent settling. With the trench excavated and the bottom prepared, the actual construction of the road could begin. But even this was not a single operation. A Roman road was built in layers, each serving a specific purpose. Like the growth rings of a tree, these layers tell a story of careful planning and patient execution. Let us examine these layers, one by one. The first layer placed in the excavated trench was the statumen. This consisted of large, flat stones laid directly on the compacted earth. These stones might be naturally flat pieces of local rock, or they might be roughly shaped by stoneworkers to achieve a flatter surface. They were fitted together as closely as possible, creating a more or less continuous stone platform at the bottom of the trench. The purpose of the statumen was to create a stable, drainage-friendly base. Water, seeping into the trench from the surrounding soil, would flow between these large stones, rather than accumulating and softening the earth beneath. The stones also help distribute weight from above across a wider area, preventing concentrated pressure points that could cause settling. Placing the statumen required judgment. The stones had to be large enough to be stable, but not so large that they couldn't be moved and positioned by the workers. A typical statumen stone might weigh anywhere from 20 to 50 pounds, though larger stones were sometimes used. Workers would select a stone, carry it to the trench, lower it into place, then adjust its position to fit snugly against the neighboring stones. This work was hard on the hands. Stone is unforgiving, it scrapes and bruises. The workers likely wore gloves when available, perhaps made of leather, but even so, their hands would have been roughened by the constant handling of rock. The work was also hard on the back, requiring constant bending, lifting, adjusting. It was the kind of labor that made young men old before their time. Once the statumen layer was complete, the second layer was added. This was the rudus, a thick layer of broken stone mixed with lime mortar. The stones for the rudus were smaller than those in the statumen, typically ranging from the size of a fist to roughly the size of a melon. They didn't need to be flat. Irregular chunks worked fine. These stones might come from quarries, or they might be fieldstone gathered from the surrounding area, or they might be broken fragments of larger rocks deliberately fractured by stoneworkers. The lime mortar mixed with the rudus served multiple purposes. It filled the spaces between stones, creating a more cohesive mass. It also helped bind the layer together. Though ancient lime mortar was not as strong as modern cement, the mortar was made by heating limestone in kilns until it broke down into quicklime, then mixing the quicklime with water and sometimes sand. This created a paste that would slowly harden as it dried and reacted with carbon dioxide in the air. Mixing and spreading the mortar was messy work. The wet lime was caustic, irritating to skin, and particularly dangerous if it got in the eyes. Workers learned to be careful, to keep their hands clean when they needed to wipe sweat from their faces. The mortar had to be used relatively quickly after mixing, before it began to set, which meant coordinating the mixing operation with the stone-laying operation. Too much mortar mixed at once would harden before it could be used. Too little meant delays while waiting for the next batch. The rudus layer was typically about 9 to 12 inches thick once compacted. Workers would spread a layer of mortar, place stones into it, add more mortar to fill gaps, then tamp the whole mass down to compress it and remove air pockets. This tamping was done with heavy wooden beams, or sometimes with stones themselves, pounding the layer until it felt solid underfoot. Above the rudus came the nucleus, similar in concept but made with finer materials. The nucleus used smaller stones, roughly gravel-sized, again mixed with lime mortar. This layer was smoother than the rudus, providing a more even surface for the final layer to rest upon. The nucleus might be 6 to 9 inches thick, again depending on the road's importance and the local construction practices. Spreading the nucleus required different techniques than the larger layers below. Workers used tools resembling modern rakes to spread the mortar and gravel mixture evenly. They worked backwards, walking on planks laid across the not yet completed section so their feet wouldn't disturb the freshly spread material. The surface of the nucleus was carefully leveled and graded to ensure proper drainage, typically with a slight crown in the center, so water would run off to the sides rather than pooling. Each of these layers required time to set before the next could be added. The lime mortar needed to begin hardening, to develop enough strength to support the next layer's weight. This meant that road construction proceeded in segments. While one section dried, workers moved ahead to prepare the next section's trench, or moved back to begin laying the next layer on a previously completed section. The rhythm of the work was thus dictated not by human impatience, but by material requirements. The stones and mortar set the pace. The workers adapted to this pace, understanding that trying to rush would only compromise the final result. Finally, at the top of all these preparatory layers came the summum dorsum, the actual road surface that travelers would walk, ride, and drive upon. This was the most visible part of the road, the part that announced Rome's presence and engineering capability. It had to be durable, smooth enough for comfortable travel, and properly shaped to shed water. For major roads, the surface consisted of carefully fitted paving stones. These were not just any stones. They were typically hard volcanic rock, often basalt, cut and shaped to fit together with minimal gaps. Each stone was polygonal, usually with 5 or 6 sides, shaped so it would interlock with its neighbors. The fitting was so precise that mortar was often unnecessary. The stones held each other in place through their careful arrangement. Shaping these paving stones was specialized work. Stone cutters would begin with rough blocks quarried from volcanic rock formations. Using hammer and chisel, they would gradually work the stone into the desired shape. The top surface needed to be relatively flat and smooth. The sides needed to be angled, so the stone would fit snugly against its neighbors. The bottom could be rougher, as it would sit on the nucleus layer below. This stone cutting was skilled labor, not something anyone could do. It required an understanding of how stone breaks, how to read the grain of the rock, how to strike with the chisel at just the right angle to remove the desired amount of material without shattering the piece. A skilled stone cutter could shape dozens of paving stones in a day. An unskilled worker trying the same task might produce 1 or 2 usable stones, if that. The shaped stones were transported to the road construction site, typically by cart if the distance was significant, or simply carried by hand if the quarry was nearby. Each stone weighed perhaps 30 to 50 pounds, heavy enough to require some effort to carry, but light enough that 1 or 2 workers could manage it. Placing the paving stones required care and patience. Workers would set each stone in place, checking that it sat firmly on the nucleus layer below and fit properly against already placed neighboring stones. If a stone wobbled or left too large a gap, it was removed and either reshaped or replaced with a better fitting stone. This fitting process was somewhat like assembling a puzzle, except that the puzzle pieces could be modified if necessary to make them fit better. The surface of the road was not perfectly flat. It was crowned, meaning it rose slightly higher in the center than at the edges. This crown was subtle, usually just a few inches of rise across a road that might be 15 or 20 feet wide, but it was essential for drainage. Water landing on the road surface would flow to the sides rather than pooling in the center. At the edges of the paved surface, ditches or gutters carried this runoff away, preventing it from undermining the road's foundation. Not all Roman roads had stone paving, however. Lesser roads, or roads in regions where suitable paving stone was scarce, might have a surface of compacted gravel, or even just well-maintained earth. These roads still had the underlying layers statumen, rudus, nucleus, but the surface was simpler, less durable, requiring more frequent maintenance. The Via Appia, that first great Roman road, was paved with basalt blocks along much of its length. These blocks came from quarries in the volcanic region southeast of Rome. When new, they would have been dark grey, almost black, smooth and hard. Over time, traffic would wear them slightly, polishing the surface where wheels and feet passed most frequently. The corners of the blocks would round slightly. The gaps between them would fill with dust and small debris, then wash clean with rain, then fill again. Walking on such a surface would have felt quite different from walking on modern pavement. The blocks were harder, less forgiving than asphalt, but they were also more stable underfoot, not subject to the slight give of modern road surfaces. In dry weather, they provided excellent traction. In wet weather, they could be slippery, particularly on slopes, but the rough texture of cut stone provided more grip than smooth marble or polished concrete. For wheeled vehicles, the paved surface was a mixed blessing. It was far better than mud or loose gravel, certainly, but the gaps between paving stones created a bumpy ride. Cartwheels would drop slightly at each gap, then rise as they climbed onto the next stone. Over mile after mile, this constant jostling could be wearing on both vehicle and passengers. Some roads had worn grooves, where cartwheels had traveled the same path for centuries, these grooves actually making the ride smoother by guiding the wheels along a consistent track. The completion of the paving marked the road's functional completion. It was now ready for use. But the work was not entirely finished. A road without proper drainage is a temporary road. Water is patient but relentless. It seeps, it pools, it freezes and thaws, gradually breaking apart even the strongest construction. The Roman engineers understood this, and so every road included carefully planned drainage features. We have already discussed the crowned surface, which directed water toward the edges, but this was only the beginning of the drainage system. At the edges of the road, parallel ditches ran alongside, typically a foot or two deep and a similar width. These ditches collected runoff from the road surface and from the surrounding land, carrying it away before it could saturate the road's foundation. The ditches were not simple channels. They were graded to ensure water flowed steadily in the desired direction, typically away from the road and toward natural drainage paths like streams or low-lying areas. In some cases, the ditches emptied into stone-lined culverts that carried water under the road at appropriate crossing points. These culverts were essentially small, short tunnels, built of stone, just large enough to let water flow through. Building a culvert was meticulous work. The bottom of the culvert had to be below the level of the road's foundation to ensure water could flow through freely. The sides and top had to be strong enough to support the weight of the road and the traffic upon it. Workers would excavate a channel at right angles to the road line, then build stone walls on either side of this channel, gradually narrowing them toward the top, using a technique called corbelling, where each course of stones projects slightly inward from the one below. Eventually the walls would meet, or nearly meet, and flat capstones would be laid across to complete the top of the culvert. The completed culvert was then buried as the road construction continued over it. From the surface, there would be no sign of the culvert's presence, except perhaps a slight change in the paving pattern, where the stones were cut to fit around the culvert's location. But water flowing in the ditches would find the culvert's entrance, flow through, and emerge on the other side, never accumulating near the road. In mountainous terrain, where slopes were steep, drainage required even more attention. Water running down a slope gains energy. It can erode ditches, undercut road foundations, and wash away supporting soil. To control this, the Romans built regular cross drains, essentially culverts placed at intervals going across the road to prevent water from building up excessive force as it ran down the slope. These cross drains might be spaced every 100 feet or so on steep sections, closer together where the slope was particularly severe. Each one required the same careful construction as any other culvert, which meant that a mountain road might contain dozens of these structures, each one invisible to travelers, but essential to the road's longevity. At the borders of the road, where the paved surface or the prepared roadbed ended and the natural landscape began, the Romans often placed boundary markers. These might be simple stones set upright, or more elaborate markers bearing inscriptions indicating the road's name, the distance to the nearest cities, and perhaps the names of the officials responsible for this section's construction or maintenance. These boundary markers served multiple purposes. They clearly defined the road's extent, preventing encroachment by neighboring landowners who might otherwise extend their fields or build structures too close to the road. They provided navigation information to travelers, and they proclaimed Roman authority, reminding everyone who saw them that this road, this infrastructure, was the work and property of Rome. Some markers were quite elaborate, carved stone pillars, 4 or 5 feet tall, their inscriptions carefully cut and sometimes highlighted with paint. Others were simpler, rough stones with basic information scratched into their surface. But whether elaborate or simple, they stood as enduring testimony to the road's official status. On either side of the road, beyond the drainage ditches, there was often an additional cleared space, a sort of neutral zone where vegetation was regularly cut back to prevent it from encroaching on the road itself. This cleared area also provided space for travelers to camp if necessary, and kept the roadside visible, reducing the risk of bandits or wild animals using dense vegetation as cover. The width of this cleared zone varied. Along some roads, particularly through forests, it might extend 20 or 30 feet to either side. Along others, through open farmland, it might be just a few feet. But the principle was consistent. The road was not just the paved surface, but an entire corridor of controlled space. Where roads met rivers too wide or deep to ford, bridges became necessary. Roman bridge building was an extension of the same engineering principles that guided road construction. Careful planning, layered construction, attention to drainage and water management, and an expectation of long-term durability. A Roman bridge began, as roads did, with surveying. Engineers assessed the river, observing its behavior through different seasons. Where was the water deepest? Where was the flow fastest? Where were the banks most stable? A bridge placed in the wrong location would be undercut by the current or washed away by floods. A bridge in the right location could stand for centuries. The ideal location for a bridge was where the river was relatively narrow, but the banks were high and solid. The narrower the span, the less expensive and complex the bridge would be. Higher banks meant the bridge could be built above typical flood levels, reducing the risk of damage during high water. Once a location was chosen, construction of the piers began. These were the vertical supports that would rise from the riverbed to hold the bridge deck. Building piers in flowing water was one of the more challenging aspects of Roman engineering. The first step was creating a cofferdam, a temporary watertight enclosure around the future pier location. Workers would drive wooden piles in a circle or rectangle, then pack clay or other water-resistant material against these piles to create a watertight barrier. Water inside the cofferdam was then bailed out, revealing the riverbed. With the riverbed exposed, workers could excavate down to solid bedrock, or if the riverbed was too deep for this, they could drive additional wooden piles into the riverbed to create a firm foundation. On this foundation, the pier would be built using stone, carefully fitted and often joined with iron clamps, sealed with lead, to prevent shifting. The pier had to be strong enough to support not just the weight of the bridge deck, but also the force of water flowing against it. To reduce this force, Roman piers were often shaped with a pointed upstream face, like the bow of a ship, to split the current and deflect it smoothly around the pier. The downstream face might be flat or also pointed, depending on the specific design. As the pier rose higher, built stone course upon stone course, the cofferdam was extended upward or rebuilt at a higher level to keep the work area dry. The mortar used to bind the stones needed time to set, and it set better when not submerged. Once a pier reached above the typical water level, the cofferdam could be removed and the pier would stand on its own, the current flowing around it. Multiple piers would be built at intervals across the river, each one a separate construction project. Though crews could work on several simultaneously if resources allowed, the spacing between piers determined the length of the spans that would connect them. Once the piers were complete, the bridge deck could be constructed. For shorter spans, large stone slabs might be placed directly from pier to pier, creating a flat walking surface. These slabs were enormously heavy, requiring cranes and teams of workers to position them. The stone came from quarries, cut to specific lengths, and transported to the bridge site by barge if possible, or by cart if necessary. For longer spans, Roman engineers used arches. The arch is one of humanity's great structural discoveries, a way to span a gap using relatively small stones arranged in a curve, each stone held in place by the pressure of its neighbors. An arch can support tremendous weight and can span considerable distances without requiring the massive stone slabs that a flat bridge would need. Building an arch required a temporary wooden framework called centering. This framework, shaped like the desired arch, supported the stones while they were being placed. Starting from both piers and working toward the center, workers laid stones in a gradually curving pattern, each stone wedge-shaped, wider at the top than the bottom. When the two sides of the arch met at the center, the final stone, the keystone, was inserted. This last stone locked the entire arch together. With the keystone in place, the arch was structurally complete. It held itself in position through the mutual pressure of all its stones. The wooden centering could then be removed, lowered away, revealing the finished arch spanning from pier to pier. It was a moment of some anxiety. This first moment, when the arch supported itself without the framework. A poorly built arch might collapse. A well-built arch would hold firm, ready to bear weight for centuries. Above the arches, additional construction created the bridge deck, a relatively flat surface for the road to continue across. This might involve filling the space between arches with earth and gravel, then paving it just like any other section of road. Or it might involve building smaller arches or vaults above the main arches to create a lighter, more elevated deck. The completed bridge was not just a river crossing, but a statement of permanence and power. Some Roman bridges included decorative elements, carved inscriptions, statues of gods or emperors, elaborate parapets. Others were simpler, purely functional, but all shared the characteristic Roman approach: careful engineering, durable materials, construction meant to last. Many Roman bridges still stand today. The Ponte Sant'Angelo in Rome, built as the Pons Aelius in 134 CE, still carries pedestrian traffic across the Tiber River. The Alcantara Bridge in Spain, completed in 106 CE, remains in use after nearly 2,000 years. These are not rare exceptions. They are representative of typical Roman bridge construction quality. As the road extended across the landscape, regular markers were placed to indicate distance and provide information to travelers. These were the milestones, cylindrical or rectangular stone pillars placed at intervals of 1,000 paces. A Roman mile, roughly equivalent to 4,800 feet, somewhat shorter than a modern mile. Each milestone bore inscriptions providing useful information. The distance to Rome was almost always included, as Rome was the conceptual center of the road network and the empire itself. The distance to the nearest significant cities in either direction might also be listed. The name of the emperor during whose reign the milestone was erected or the road was constructed or repaired appeared prominently, as did the names of any notable officials involved in the work. Creating a milestone began with selecting an appropriate stone. It needed to be durable, capable of being carved with inscriptions that would remain legible for years. Granite, marble, and limestone were common choices. The stone was cut roughly to shape, then smoothed on the sides where inscriptions would appear. The inscriptions were carved by skilled stone cutters, using hammer and chisel. The letters were typically in capital form, what we now call Roman capitals, cut relatively deeply into the stone, so they would remain visible even as weather and time wore at the surface. Once carved, the letters might be painted to make them more visible to travelers, though this paint would eventually fade and require renewal. The milestone was then transported to its designated location along the road and set upright in the ground, sunk deep enough to be stable. Some milestones show evidence of having been reset or re-erected if they fell over due to ground settling or other causes. Walking along a Roman road, a traveler could navigate by these milestones, counting down the distance to their destination. This made journey planning possible. Knowing you were 10 miles from the next town, you could estimate how long the journey would take, whether you could reach it before nightfall, whether you should camp or continue. But milestones were not the only infrastructure supporting travelers. At regular intervals, typically a day's journey apart, way stations provided places to rest, obtain food and water, and shelter for the night. These way stations varied in size and amenities, depending on the road's importance and the region. A typical way station might include stables for animals, sleeping quarters for travelers, a dining area, and facilities for basic maintenance of carts and equipment. Some way stations were operated by private individuals who profited from providing services to travelers. Others were maintained by the government, particularly along roads primarily used for official traffic. The Mansio was an official way station, part of the cursus publicus, the imperial courier and transport service. These facilities were primarily for government officials and military personnel traveling on official business, though they might accommodate other travelers if space allowed. A mansio would have more substantial accommodations than a private inn and separate rooms rather than communal sleeping areas, better quality food, facilities for changing horses if one was traveling by imperial courier. Between mansiones, at shorter intervals, were mutationes, changing stations where the cursus publicus maintained fresh horses. An imperial courier might ride from one mutatio to the next, exchange their tired horse for a fresh one, and continue immediately. This system allowed messages to travel with remarkable speed across the empire, much faster than any individual horse and rider could travel without stopping to rest. The spacing of these stations was carefully calculated. A horse could sustain a fast pace for about 10 to 15 miles before needing rest, so mutationes were placed at roughly this interval. A person walking could travel 15 to 20 miles in a day, comfortably, so mansiones were spaced accordingly. For travelers not part of the official courier system, there were taverns and inns at various points along the road. These establishments varied considerably in quality. Some were respectable, clean, offering good food and safe lodging. Others had less sterling reputations, known as places where travelers might be robbed or cheated. Ancient Roman literature contains numerous references to disreputable roadside inns, suggesting that travelers learned to be cautious about where they stopped. Some sections of road passed through largely uninhabited areas where established way stations were impractical. Here, travelers might camp by the roadside, using the cleared space beside the road. Evidence suggests that regular camping spots developed at convenient distances, places where water was available, where the ground was relatively flat, where previous travelers had used the same spot. Over time, these informal camping areas might develop into more established settlements, eventually, perhaps supporting a permanent inn or tavern. The network of roads and the infrastructure supporting them created possibilities for travel and communication that would not be matched in Europe until modern times. A merchant in Britain could calculate how long it would take to transport goods to Rome. A military commander in Syria could send a message to the emperor and expect a response within a predictable time frame. An administrator, assigned to a new post, could plan their journey, knowing where they would find lodging each night. Building a road was only the beginning of its story. Maintaining it was an ongoing task that would continue as long as the empire stood and the road remained in use. Traffic wore at the road surface. Cartwheels ground against the paving stones. Horses' hooves struck the surface thousands of times. Marching boots scuffed and scraped. Rainwater seeped into any small gaps and, in winter, in colder regions, froze and expanded, gradually widening cracks. Wind-blown dust and debris accumulated in gaps between stones. Plant roots sought moisture and nutrients, sometimes finding purchase in the road's joints and slowly forcing stones apart as they grew. Against all of this, maintenance crews worked to preserve the road. These were often local crews assigned to maintain specific sections of road. The work might be done by local residents as a form of tax payment, or by paid workers, or by soldiers in garrison during peacetime when they needed productive tasks. Regular inspections identified problems before they became serious. A stone slightly displaced could be reset before it became fully dislodged. A small gap could be remortared before water penetrated deep into the road's structure. A drainage ditch that had partially filled with silt could be cleared before the next heavy rain. Paving stones that had cracked or broken needed to be replaced. This required removing the damaged stone, which was sometimes easier said than done. If the stone was firmly wedged between its neighbors, it had to be carefully broken up and removed in pieces, or the surrounding stones had to be temporarily disturbed to allow the damaged stone to be lifted out. A replacement stone, either newly cut or salvaged from elsewhere, would be fitted into the gap, ensuring it matched the level and profile of the surrounding surface. In areas with particularly heavy traffic, entire sections of road might need to be repaved every few decades. The old paving stones would be removed, the nucleus layer beneath inspected and repaired if necessary, and new paving stones installed. This was essentially rebuilding the road's surface while preserving the deeper structure. Ditches required regular clearing. Silt, leaves, dead plants, and other debris accumulated gradually, reducing the ditch's capacity to handle water. Maintenance crews would use shovels and baskets to remove this material, restoring the ditch to its original depth and profile. The removed material might be spread on adjacent fields if it was soil, or disposed of if it was debris. Culverts could become blocked, leading to water backing up and potentially undermining the road. Inspecting and clearing culverts was important but unpleasant work. The culverts were small, dark, often filled with muddy water and decomposing leaves. Workers would have to reach into them, or sometimes crawl partially inside, to remove blockages. After significant storms, emergency repairs might be needed. A flash flood could wash out a section of roadbed. A landslide on a mountain road could cover the surface with debris. Winter ice could damage bridge parapets or dislodge paving stones. Maintenance crews responded to these events, clearing debris, making temporary repairs to restore passability, then returning later to make more permanent fixes. The Romans understood that prevention was easier than cure. Regular maintenance was not just about fixing problems after they occurred, but about preventing problems from developing. A well-maintained road lasted longer and required less dramatic intervention than a neglected one. Responsibility for maintenance was clearly assigned. Major roads connecting important cities were typically maintained at imperial expense, with funds allocated from the treasury and work supervised by appointed officials. Lesser roads might be the responsibility of local communities, who maintained them for their own benefit and that of travelers passing through. Some inscriptions on milestones record not just the original construction, but later repairs and maintenance work. An emperor might have his name added to a milestone when his administration funded major resurfacing work, even if the road itself was centuries old. These inscriptions provide a historical record of ongoing care, extending over generations. In some ways, the maintenance of Roman roads was as impressive as their original construction. Building something magnificent is a singular achievement, requiring vision and will and resources concentrated at one point in time. Maintaining that thing year after year, decade after decade, century after century, requires sustained commitment, institutional memory, and a cultural understanding that this infrastructure matters, that it deserves care. Many Roman roads remained in good condition for centuries. Some are still usable today, more than 2,000 years after their construction, though often they've been repaved with modern materials. The underlying structure, those careful layers of stone and gravel and mortar, remains sound beneath. What was it like to walk on these roads? To be a traveler in the Roman Empire, stepping onto the Via Appia or the Via Flaminia, or any of the hundreds of other roads that wove the empire together? In the early morning, the paving stones might still be damp with dew. The air would be cool. If you were setting out from a town or city, you might hear the sounds of other travelers preparing for their journeys. Pack animals being loaded, carts being checked, conversations about the day's route. As you walked, the rhythm of your footsteps on the stone would be steady, unchanging. The crowned surface of the road meant you might walk slightly off-center to avoid the highest point, where water had polished the stones smoothest and where they might be slippery when wet. The drainage ditches on either side would be visible, sometimes flowing with water after recent rain, sometimes dry and dusty. The road stretched ahead, sometimes straight for miles, sometimes curving to follow the terrain. Milestones appeared at regular intervals, their inscriptions weathered but still legible if you stopped to read them. Each milestone marked progress. 1,000 paces closer to your destination, other travelers would pass going the opposite direction. A messenger on horseback, riding quickly. A merchant with a cart laden with goods, oxen plodding steadily. A small group of soldiers, their armor and weapons marking them as military. A family traveling together, perhaps relocating to a new city, their possessions carried on their backs or piled on a small cart. You might exchange greetings with these travelers, or simply nod in acknowledgement. The road created a temporary community of motion, people sharing this common path, even if their origins and destinations differed. At midday, the sun would be directly overhead, and you might seek shade if you were tired and the heat was strong. Trees along the roadside, if any existed, would provide relief. Or you might simply continue, knowing that the next way station was only a few more miles ahead, where you could rest properly and obtain food and water. The physical experience of walking for miles would vary by season. In summer, heat and dust. In winter, cold and sometimes mud, despite the road's good drainage. In spring and fall, more pleasant temperatures, but also the possibility of sudden rain showers. The paving stones provided sure footing even in rain, though they became slightly slippery when wet. If you traveled regularly, you would become familiar with particular sections of road. That one milestone with the chip in its upper right corner, that section where the road crosses a small stream via a stone bridge, and there's usually a cool breeze coming up from the water, that stretch through a forest where the trees make a sort of natural tunnel over the road. You would develop preferences for certain way stations, knowing which ones had better food, which ones had more comfortable sleeping arrangements, which ones charged fair prices. You might look forward to reaching a familiar stopping point, greeting the innkeeper who recognized you from previous journeys. The road connected you not just physically to distant places, but socially to a broader world. You might overhear conversations in languages you didn't understand, spoken by travelers from distant provinces. You might see goods being transported that were exotic to your region, silk from the Far East, wine from particular renowned vineyards, olive oil in sealed amphorae, grain from Egypt. For someone who rarely traveled, a journey on one of the great Roman roads might be memorable, even overwhelming. The scale of the infrastructure, the steady flow of diverse people and goods, the sense of being part of something larger than your local community. All of this would be impressive. For a soldier marching with a legion, the road was different. You traveled in formation, maintaining pace with your unit. The weight of your pack, armor, and weapons added to the effort. The distance covered each day was mandated, not optional. When you stopped for the night, you didn't seek an inn, but helped construct a marching camp, a temporary fortification that would be built, used, and abandoned within a day. For a courier carrying imperial messages, the road was a task to be completed as quickly as possible. You didn't admire the scenery or contemplate the engineering. You rode from one mutatio to the next, exchanged horses, and rode on. Your entire focus was on speed and endurance, knowing that the message you carried might be important, might affect events in distant places. For a merchant transporting goods, the road was a business tool. You calculated costs and distances, planned your route to pass through markets at opportune times, worried about the security of your cargo, kept account of expenses, and anticipated profits. All of these human experiences played out on the same physical infrastructure, those carefully laid stones, those engineered drainage systems, those bridges and milestones and way stations. The road accommodated all travelers, regardless of their purpose or status, offering the same reliable surface to all. Individual roads were impressive, but the true achievement was the network. Roads that connected to other roads, creating a web of possible routes across the empire. From any major city, you could reach any other major city by following a connected series of roads, never needing to travel through unmarked wilderness. Maps of the Roman road network show this interconnection. Primary roads radiated from Rome itself, heading to all points of the compass. Secondary roads connected other major cities. Tertiary roads served local regions. Altogether, they formed a system. This network had emerged gradually, not from a single master plan, but from accumulated decisions over centuries. The earliest roads served the needs of early Rome military routes to contested territories, trade routes to important resources. As the empire expanded, new roads were added, extending the network into newly conquered regions. Each new province required roads. When Roman forces moved into Britain, roads followed. When they established control in Gaul, roads were built. When they pushed eastward to the Danube and beyond, roads connected these distant frontiers to the core of the empire. The network created redundancy and options. If one road was blocked by weather or other circumstances, alternative routes usually existed. A traveler heading from Rome to the northern frontier could choose from several different paths, each passing through different cities, each with its own characteristics. This redundancy was particularly important for military purposes. An army moving to respond to a threat could select a route based on current conditions, avoiding areas affected by recent flooding or where intelligence suggested enemy activity. The road network provided strategic flexibility. For trade, the network meant goods could flow efficiently throughout the empire. Wine from Spain could reach markets in Greece. Grain from Egypt could feed populations in Italy. Exotic goods arriving by ship at Mediterranean ports could be distributed inland along the roads. The roads reduced transport costs and time, making long-distance trade more practical and profitable. The network also facilitated cultural exchange. Ideas, religions, artistic styles, and technologies spread along the roads, along with people and goods. An architectural innovation developed in one region might be adopted elsewhere when travelers saw it and brought the knowledge home. Philosophical schools attracted students from across the empire who could travel to study with particular teachers. Religious practices spread as believers traveled and shared their faith. Managing this vast network required organization. The cursus publicus, the imperial courier service, maintained way stations and organized the movement of official communications. Local administrators oversaw maintenance of roads in their regions. Military engineers accompanied legions to construct or repair roads as needed in frontier areas. Information about the network was recorded and shared. Maps existed, though they were more schematic than modern geographic maps. The Tabula Peutingeriana, a medieval copy of a Roman original, shows the road network as a series of lines connecting symbols for cities, with distance markers indicated. This map is not drawn to geographic scale. It stretches east-west while compressing north-south. But it accurately shows connections and distances, which was what mattered for planning travel. Written itineraries listed routes from one place to another, specifying each stop along the way and the distance between stops. The Antonine itinerary, compiled in the late 3rd century CE, provides detailed route information for journeys throughout the empire. A traveler could consult such a document to plan their journey, knowing exactly what sequence of towns and way stations they would encounter. The existence of this documented information shows that the Romans thought of their roads as a system, not just as individual projects. They understood that the value of the network exceeded the sum of its parts. Each individual road was useful, but all roads together, interconnected and documented, created something far more valuable. This systematic thinking extended to standards. While roads varied in their details based on local materials and conditions, the basic construction principles remained consistent. A traveler who had experience with roads in one part of the empire would know what to expect from roads elsewhere. The reliability was itself valuable. The Roman Empire's political structure eventually weakened and fragmented. The Western Empire formally ended in 476 CE, though its decline had been underway for much longer. The Eastern Empire, based in Constantinople, continued for another 1,000 years, but its control over the old Western provinces ceased. As central authority weakened, so did the organized maintenance of the road network. Local communities might continue to maintain roads that served their immediate needs, but long-distance roads passing through sparsely populated areas received less attention. The cursus publicus, the imperial courier system, eventually ceased to function. Without regular maintenance, roads began to deteriorate. Paving stones displaced by frost or traffic went unreplaced. Drainage ditches filled with debris and were not cleared. Bridges, damaged by floods, were not repaired. Vegetation encroached on roadbeds. Some roads remained in use throughout the medieval period, particularly roads connecting major cities that remained important trade centers. These roads continued to be maintained, though perhaps not to the same standards as during the empire's height. The Via Appia remained a major route for pilgrimages to Rome throughout the medieval period and beyond. Other roads gradually fell into disuse as the patterns of settlement and trade shifted. Villages might be abandoned, cities might shrink in population, and the routes that connected them became less traveled. These roads might revert to paths, or even disappear entirely as fields expanded over them and the stones were taken for other building projects. In many areas, Roman paving stones were quarried for reuse in medieval construction. The stones were already cut and of good quality, making them valuable building material. Churches, fortifications, and other structures incorporated Roman road stones. This recycling destroyed the roads as functional infrastructure, but preserved the stones themselves, giving them new purposes. Yet many roads survived. Even where the paving was removed or buried, the underlying structure that carefully prepared foundation often remained intact. Modern roads sometimes follow the exact paths of Roman roads, built on top of those ancient foundations. Archaeological investigations of modern roads sometimes reveal the layers of Roman construction still present below. In some places, sections of Roman road remain visible and even usable today. Portions of the Via Appia can still be walked, the original basalt paving stones still in place, still carrying their ancient grooves where cartwheels wore into them. These sections are now tourist destinations and archaeological sites, preserved deliberately as historical monuments. The legacy of Roman roads extends beyond the physical remains. The concept of a maintained public road network, funded and organized by governmental authority for the common good, became a standard model. Medieval and early modern European road building often explicitly referenced Roman examples. The surveying techniques developed for Roman roads influenced later engineering. The careful attention to drainage, to stable foundations, to the layered construction that distributes load properly. All of these principles remained valid and were rediscovered or preserved through the study of Roman examples. Even the routes themselves had lasting influence. Medieval roads often followed Roman routes because those routes were well chosen, following efficient paths through the landscape. Modern highways in Europe frequently parallel ancient Roman roads for the same reason. The Romans had already done the work of finding the best routes, and their choices often remain optimal. The symbolic legacy is perhaps even more significant than the practical one. Roman roads represented the possibility of long-distance communication and travel. The idea that an empire could be bound together by infrastructure, that remote regions could be connected to centers of power. This idea influenced later empires and nations. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," became a proverb, suggesting both the centrality of Rome and the interconnected nature of the road network. Though the saying is more metaphorical than literal, it captures something true about how the Romans conceived of their roads, not as isolated projects, but as parts of a system radiating from and returning to the capital. When modern nations began building highway networks in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Roman roads served as historical precedent and inspiration. The idea that a government should invest in a comprehensive road network for military, economic, and social purposes This idea has Roman roots. We have followed the construction of a Roman road from the initial surveying, through the careful layering of stone, from the drainage systems to the paving surface, from the bridges that carried roads across rivers to the milestones that marked distances, from the way stations that supported travelers to the maintenance that kept roads functional for centuries. Each of these elements represented patient, methodical work. There was little about Roman road building that was dramatic or exciting. It was, instead, steady and deliberate, one stone placed after another, one layer completed before the next began. Day after day, year after year, the roads extended across the landscape. The workers who built these roads probably did not think they were creating monuments that would last 2,000 years. They were doing a job, earning wages, or fulfilling obligations. They cleared vegetation, excavated trenches, placed stones, mixed mortar, fitted paving blocks. The work was hard, physical, sometimes tedious. Yet the accumulation of all this ordinary labor produced something extraordinary. A network of roads that connected an empire, that facilitated communication and trade, that enabled armies to move quickly and merchants to transport goods efficiently, that allowed ideas and people to travel across vast distances. The roads were not built quickly, but they were built to last. The care invested in their foundation, in their drainage, in the quality of their materials and construction, paid dividends across centuries. While individual stones might be displaced or damaged, the overall structure remained sound. When we think about infrastructure today, about the roads and bridges and systems that support modern life, the Roman roads offer perspective. They remind us that well-built infrastructure can serve many generations. They show us that investment in foundational quality pays long-term dividends. They demonstrate that patient, careful work can produce results that outlast empires. Many of the workers who built these roads are anonymous to us now. Their names were not carved on milestones. They appear in no historical records, but their work remains, enduring testament to their skill and effort. The next time you travel on a road, whether a modern highway or an ancient path, you might pause to consider what lies beneath. The careful grading of the foundation, the drainage systems that manage water, the materials selected for their durability, the accumulated knowledge of generations of builders. Roads connect places, yes, but they also connect times. They link us to the past, to the people who built them and who traveled on them. They remind us of continuity, of the way human effort accumulates across generations. The Roman roads were built to serve the empire, but they served travelers, people going about their lives, their business, their journeys. The roads accommodated them all, offering the same firm surface, the same reliable passage, regardless of who was walking or riding or driving upon them. In this, perhaps, lies their deepest lesson. Infrastructure serves everyone. It is a common good, built through collective effort, offering benefit beyond those who constructed it. The roads outlasted the empire that built them because they continued to be useful, continued to serve the needs of travelers, continued to connect places and people. As you rest now, as your breathing slows and your thoughts settle, you might imagine one of these roads. The morning sun illuminating the ancient paving stones. The silence of a route that once carried thousands of travelers but now rests quietly, its purpose fulfilled, its work done. The stones remain, patient and enduring, testament to careful labor and thoughtful engineering. The road waits. It has waited for centuries, and it will wait centuries more. There is no urgency in stone, no anxiety in paving laid with care. Only presence, only persistence. Rest now, as the stones rest, as the road rests, as all things rest when their work is done and done well. Rest now.